Everyone, and welcome to today's GFI LINC seminar. My name is Carlotta Lucas. I'm the Good Food Institute Europe's Senior Corporate Engagement Manager. I am joined today by my colleagues Marika Azoff and Molly O'Donnell. Marika is GFI US's Senior Corporate Engagement Specialist. You'll be hearing from her as well today. And Molly O'Donnell is GFI US's Corporate Engagement Project Manager. So for those of you who are attending your first LINC seminar, LINC stands for Learn, Inspire, Network, and Collaborate. And we really started because over the year, we as GFI have received feedback from various stakeholders our team interact with, including food manufacturers and suppliers. And we heard from them that there's a desire for more opportunities to connect and collaborate with other companies in the space. And while one-to-one introductions can be made, we really want to provide a space for industry stakeholders such as yourselves to convene, learn together, network, and collaborate. So we founded the LINC community, and it's really based upon the belief that by convening a diverse range of stakeholders, we can drive industry-wide change and grow this sector in a way that benefits all. So we hold seminars once a quarter. Each session is dedicated to a specific topic that GFI's research indicates is critical to addressing industry bottlenecks and accelerating the growth of the alternative protein sector. Today's topic is about how food companies can achieve their ESG goals. And we're diving into this topic because over the last few years, investors have really become increasingly aware and they are acknowledging the fact that climate and social risks are also market risks. And so there's been a growing focus on incorporating ESG, or otherwise known as environment, social, and governance risk factors in investment strategies. In turn, companies such as yourselves across all industries, including food and agriculture, are assessing opportunities to mitigate risks in their business operations. So today we'll hear from experts about how alternative proteins can help companies meet their ESG goals, as well as provide an overview of the current ESG reporting landscape and the new alternative protein ESG framework, which has been developed by GFI and FAIRR. So if all is well, you can see the agenda on the slide, or the slide will be popping up soon. Today's seminar will be about an hour long, followed by a 30-minute networking session on the platform Meetaway, which I'll explain shortly. And throughout the presentations, please put any questions you may have in the Q&A box. We'll have a few minutes after each speaker to dive into those. We're also recording this seminar, so all of you will receive a link to the recording along with a feedback survey afterwards. And lastly, as I just briefly mentioned, you've been pre-registered for the networking session in the platform Meetaway. So if you'd like to attend, I will direct everyone there after the presentations. Marika will add the link in the chat right now, so you can already dive a little bit into the platform if you're interested, but we will do so again at the end of the presentation. And with that, I'd like to introduce our first speaker of the day, Sofia de la Parra, Investor Outreach Manager at FAIRR. So Sofia is responsible for strengthening and expanding FAIRR's investor network, and she works closely with investor members to integrate material ESG issues and develop sustainable food systems as a key priority. Today, Sofia is going to give us an overview of the ESG risks present in food production and the opportunity that alternative proteins provide. So, all right, Sofia, over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to share my slide deck here. Great. And well, yeah, thank you for having me. As mentioned, I'll be presenting on ESG risks and opportunities. And I'll take you through, I'll start by giving you a brief introduction of what FAIRR is and our line of work is. And then I'll jump into an overview of what the FAIRR Color Protein Producer Index is, which is a tool that helps investors understand ESG risks that are relevant for the protein producer sector. And then I'll end with an overview of engaging with corporates on the opportunity side of the coin, on how we see protein diversification as a climate mitigation tool that is key for net zero pathways. So what is FAIRR? The FAIRR Initiative is a non-for-profit organization comprising of an investor network with over 350 investor members that have $70 trillion in assets. FAIRR was launched 6 years ago to fill the gap of the ESG market by assessing the food sector. And FAIRR helps bridge the gap of knowledge using investor influence to help and guide the world's transition toward more sustainable food systems. Investors around the world come to us to better understand the nuances of food systems, and our network includes asset owners and managers like insurance companies, pension funds, and endowments. So why do we focus on the particular subsector of animal agriculture within food systems? As you all know, food systems are complex and broad. So here I'd like to draw on the Pareto principle when analyzing the food system, which says that 80% of the results are linked to 20% of the causes. We've identified animal agriculture of the cause of immense environmental impact, narrowing our focus and making our work much more impactful. To illustrate this, the pie chart represents global climate impact from different sectors. The icons of the cows highlight the sectors related to industrial animal farming. So for example, chemical and petrochemical accounts for the manufacturing of fertilizers and pharmaceuticals. And here I'd like to highlight that 73% of the antibiotics sold worldwide today are used for livestock. So as you can see, the sector's impacts go beyond greenhouse gas emissions as they severely deplete land, use a lot of water, create eutrophication and energy use, which makes it a high priority for SDGs and the Paris Agreement goal. So as you know, we are an investor network, and you might ask yourself, why do investors care? Well, because of the exposure of animal agriculture brings with it material ESG risks and opportunities for them. And this materiality is FAIRR's focus. FAIRR has identified these 9 risks as having the highest material impact in the industry. Some of these risks have a more visible impact due to the short-term events, but in reality, is the financial performance on the companies of the sector depends on their longer-term ability to anticipate and navigate transition and physical risks. Besides, the sector is also experiencing dynamism and disruptive technologies, which represents investors with unique opportunities. For example, consumer demand and private investments into the alternative proteins have exponentially grown during the past decade. So besides taking a holistic approach around the ESG risks associated with the sector, we also take a comprehensive approach and cover the whole value chain, engaging with companies from pharma all the way to the fork, covering more than 100 companies. We're using a domino effect to achieve systemic change. And what do we offer to our investor members? We classify our outputs in roughly 3 pillars. The first one is that we offer a broad set of data and tools, including the Protein Producer Index, the Sustainable Proteins Hub, the Climate Risk Tool that helps investors quantify the implications of climate change on the mid sector. Secondly, we publish thematic reports. And thirdly, we facilitate collaborative engagements between the bond and shareholders and the corporates. So from our first pillar on tools and benchmarks, our flagship is the Color FAIRR Protein Producer Index. This index is an ESG benchmark that assesses the 60 largest publicly listed animal protein producers and processors across relevant different risk and opportunity factors. The companies in the index are selected due to 2 main criteria. Number 1 is their material exposure to animal protein categories that we cover, which are beef, dairy, pork, poultry, and aquaculture. And secondly, their market cap. They have a minimum market cap of 450 million. So as you can see, these companies operate across multiple regions around the world. Some notable stats about our risk factors include, firstly, agricultural production accounts for 1/3 of all greenhouse gas emissions. Secondly, livestock farming is the single largest driver of deforestation and biodiversity loss. Number 3 is agricultural production uses 30% of the planet's freshwater resources. This is an industry that is consuming the largest amount of fresh water, even more so than human consumption. Number 4 is the volume of manure produced by the 70 billion animals processed by the global food system today every year is equivalent to the waste produced by twice of the entire human population. Number 5 is global meat production accounts for 73% of global antibiotic use, being this a key battleground in the war against antimicrobial resistance. And lastly, poor and unsafe working conditions persistent in the sector are a risk to animal farming companies. This includes supply chains disruptions, reputational risks, fines, prosecutor investigations, and lawsuits from employees. The index currently aligns with existing methodologies to reduce the corporate reporting burden. The index is also sector-specific, ensuring that the KPIs are specific to the specific industry that we are targeting. Finally, we assess the company disclosure against the most material risks and issues to ensure we are improving real-world outcomes on the global protein supply chain. You can explore the index with much more detail and download a public version of a report from our website, which was published 3 months ago. Now, turning more towards the opportunity side of the coin, and under our third pillar of collaborative engagements, I'll take you through the sustainable proteins one that we have. This collaborative engagement has been a multi-year one, running during 2022, its 6th phase. And this engagement's objective is to encourage the target companies to set time-bound commitments to increase the share of nutritious, plant-based and alternative proteins in their portfolios. By doing so, companies would be supporting the dietary transition towards less and better quality animal-derived products whilst building sustainable food systems. This engagement was supported by 84 investors with almost 23 trillion of assets and targets, as you can see, some of the largest food retailers and manufacturers around the world. So last year we published a report with the findings of this engagement, which you can download from our website as well, but I'll highlight a few key takeaways. So firstly, there has been a big improvement, specifically if we compare 2019 with 2022. So in 2019, 8% of the companies have set net zero targets, whereas in 2022, 70% of them did. However, only 10 companies had committed to follow the SBTi standards for these targets. The second finding is that we have done some quality control on these targets, and we found significant room for improvement, as only 50% of those targets actually cover emissions from the supply chain. And why is this an issue? Maybe you already know the answer to this, but you can see on the chart to the right that on average, 94% of the total emissions from these companies are categorized as scope 3. So that leads me to my third key finding, which is that 35% of the companies in the engagement have committed to increasing the volume or sales of meat and dairy alternatives. This is really great news, as in 2019, no companies had such target. But the issue is setting net zero targets, so the 70% versus the 35% that have protein diversification targets. It's clear, given that emissions from animal agriculture are one of the most prevalent sources of greenhouse gases for these companies. Approximately 33% of the carbon footprint is derived from this. There is a lot of, as well as examples from the companies that we engage with, showing that protein diversification is an effective climate mitigation tool that can support these companies achieve their net zero targets. And while many companies in the engagement are expanding their plant-based portfolio, as well as their alternative protein portfolio, not all of them have made the connection between protein diversification and climate mitigation. So what does best practice look like? Those leading the ranking that we publish every year are taking a dual approach to protein diversification. This means that they combine initiatives that are addressing both the supply side and the demand side. On the former, they're implementing sustainable sourcing for animal-derived products, as well as alternative proteins and plant-based foods. They are diversifying their procurement of ingredients away from carbon-intensive sources. On the other hand, they address the demand side by not only responding to consumer behavioral change, but also encouraging the growth of alternative proteins and plant-based foods. At the category level, these companies are making it easy, accessible, and attractive to consumers to transition their diets. So I want to wrap up saying that a common trajectory for a food company to follow in establishing a comprehensive and strategic approach to protein diversification begins with companies building an understanding of their current and future risk exposure to animal protein supply chains through either risk assessments or scenario analysis. Understanding Scope 3 emissions, including those from animal agriculture, is fundamental first step that enables these companies to appreciate the outsized contribution typical of the protein supply chains. This has influenced the evolution of many company strategies, promoting a reevaluation of existing supply chain efforts and moving towards a dual approach. Thank you so much, and I'm happy to take any questions now.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sophia. I think that sets up for a great session today. Marika, the floor is yours if there were any questions coming in.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sophia. And folks, I got a couple direct message questions, but please feel free to post any additional ones in the chat. So Sophia, one question, a member was curious to learn a little bit more about your work with your investor members. Are the investors you work with mostly like environmental or sustainability focused? And does FAIRR do kind of cold outreach to the broader investor community?
So in terms of our investor network, as I mentioned, we have more than 350 with 70 trillion, which means we cover the largest asset managers around the world, which have, some of them do have very specific agendas around impact investing, but others are pretty much mainstream asset managers that do have a part of their business or their products more aligned towards ESG, but they also cover more general. And in terms of calling out to outreach more, we're always, of course, trying to expand our network. Joining the FAIRR initiative is free, so every investor that is interested in joining our network can do so. We have, as I mentioned, mostly large institutional investors, but we also have private equity and VC funds that are part of our membership.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So I'm just curious if you have a rough sense of the percentage of companies, whether within kind of those 23 that you're working on or just in general, that are addressing Scope 3 emissions. Again, you don't have to give an exact percentage. And what are kind of the driving factors behind these companies' decisions to do so? And are you seeing that happening more in certain geographic regions than others?
Yeah, it's a really good question. In terms of Scope 3, yes, indeed, out of the 23, most of them are addressing them. How are they doing that? Well, of course, setting Scope 3 targets. As of up until this year, it was SBTi considered the gold standard. And now, of course, with the flag targets coming in into play, this will change because the companies will have to set sector-specific targets. But most of the companies have a Scope 3 target. Nevertheless, what we found as well is that these targets are sometimes very difficult to compare across the companies, which becomes a challenge for investors to identify, who's at the top, who's following. So a few things that we picked up from that is, the alignment, the warming alignment of these targets is relevant. Sometimes it's not comparable. Sometimes it's 1.5, sometimes it's 2 degrees. So that part is quite relevant. Also, the actual absolute emissions that these targets would end up in is something that companies are addressing differently. But yeah, I'd encourage anyone that wants a little bit more detail, either to go to our website and explore our benchmark and understand how exactly you are assessing. I mean, it's definitely target setting and then disclosure against that target. So we ask the companies to disclose year-over-year progress in terms of achieving that Scope 3 target.
Excellent, thorough answer. Thank you so much. So it sounds like in terms of geographies, it's all over the map.
In line with regulation, we see that companies based in Europe and the UK have more advanced practices. The ones in the US, which is quite a few in our benchmark, are starting their pathway there, but are a little bit behind.
Yes, wonderful. Last question, unless someone else posts something in the Q&A box. You mentioned the different types of animal agriculture that FAIRR addresses. It seemed mostly like, I think that I didn't hear you mention wild-caught seafood, only aquaculture, and just curious if you could share a little bit more of your reasoning behind those decisions, the decision to choose those specific types of animal agriculture.
Yeah, well, first of all, it's the largest companies, and of course, that covers mostly aquaculture. We have engagements with salmon producers that we also engage on the topic of sustainable feed. But yeah, aquaculture is how we cover, those companies.
Understandable. All right, Sophia, thank you so much for your time. I will pass it over to Carlotta.
Wonderful. Thanks both. Well, now that we have a bit of a better understanding of some of the risks around animal agriculture and how alternative proteins can link to ESG goals, I'd love to introduce Devin Bonney, who will give us an overview of the ESG reporting landscape. I know I already heard quite a few acronyms being thrown out, and I think Devin will help us understand that a little bit more. So Devin leads research and standards development for the International Sustainability Standards Board, or ISSB, focusing on ISSB's climate-related disclosure standard and the food and beverage sector of the SASB Standards. And her role is centered around engagements with industry, investors, and subject matter experts to develop and drive adoption of these standards. So Devin, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Charlotte. And always a pleasure to follow FAIRR in this space. So I'm just going to share some slides. Can you all see those?
Yes, we can.
Great. So as Charlotte mentioned, I work for the International Sustainability Standards Board, and this was formed in August of 2022, so fairly recently, with the objective to develop standards for a global baseline, or to create a global baseline of sustainability disclosure, meet information needs of investors, and enable companies to provide a comprehensive sustainability information to the global capital markets, and then to facilitate the addition of disclosures that may be more jurisdiction specific, aimed at a broader stakeholder group. And so the ISSB formed under the IFRS Foundation, which sets international accounting standards as well. And we really brought together many different organizations to form the ISSB to help simplify the sustainability disclosure landscape. And so it brought together the integrated reporting, the SASB standards, the Climate Disclosure Standards Board, TCFD, and the World Economic Forum, all to form this IFRS sustainability effort to help sort of simplify the alphabet soup of disclosure, if you will. So if we look at how does IFRS sustainability or the ISSB standards fit into the broader landscape, you have typical financial statements that are produced by IFRS, the International Accounting Standards Board under the IFRS, but also GAAP, things like that, that solely focus on financial statements and disclosure. And then if we layer on top of that sustainability related financial disclosures, that's really where we're trying to play and the jurisdictional specific initiatives are happening. And then we have other reporting disclosures such as GRI and things like that. So it's really the ISSB and the sustainability standards that we're producing are really meant to complement financial statements with the purpose of reporting investor-focused information that's decision useful. Again, the goal of the IFRS Sustainability Organization is to develop a baseline to act as a comprehensive foundation for sustainability disclosures of companies, to have a common language around how to deliver comparable decision useful information. And they're really meant for global capital markets, meaning global investor needs. And then companies, if they disclose to IFRS sustainability standards, they could layer on the jurisdictional standards that may be coming, such as the SEC proposal, or other voluntary standards like GRI. So we've been very busy since August. So last year, the Sustainability Organization produced 2 exposure drafts of 2 different standards. The first one we call IFRS S1, which is really general sustainability related risks and opportunities, and it lays out what companies should disclose in terms of the 4 pillars included in TCFD, and sets out general reporting requirements. And it refers to other standards and frameworks, which I'll get into in a minute. And if anyone is familiar with IFRS accounting standards, it's similar to IAS 1 and 8. And really, this is meant to provide consistency and connection between financial statements and sustainability disclosures. Really looking at, asking companies, ideally, financial statements and sustainability reports would be published at the same time so that investors are getting this suite of information all together. And it doesn't specify location-specific disclosure requirements. And then the second disclosure standard that we're working on and had an exposure draft on is IFRS S2, which is specific to the climate-related risks and opportunities that an entity might face. This is really where we incorporate TCFD recommendations. It also includes industry-specific requirements. So the standard says that a company must disclose industry-specific standard sustainability information. And a good example of this is financed emissions. There's also some food and bev, or just it requires companies to disclose that. And it says it strongly encourages looking at the SASB standards, but a company could also use other disclosure requirements to meet that standard. And it requires disclosures of information about physical risk, transition risk, and then climate-related opportunities. We also ask for transition planning, so emissions targets and use of carbon offset disclosures, climate resilience, and then we also require Scope 1 through Scope 3 emission disclosures in accordance to the GHG protocol. So the priorities of the IFRS Sustainability Organization moving forward is that towards the end of the second quarter of this year, we're hoping to publish final versions of the general sustainability disclosure requirements, and then the climate specific ones as well. And then we're working to strengthen and enhance the adoption of the standards through capacity building, especially for markets that might be less used to industry specific requirements, develop a digital taxonomy to ease the use of disclosure and help investors ingest that information. We're working very hard to internationalize some of the SASB standards, working to connect more with the IASB, so our counter board under IFRS, working on interoperability with GRI and FRAG in Europe. So the goal being that if a company were disclosed to FRAG or ours, that it would satisfy both requirements, and then conduct additional research to produce incremental enhancements to the climate standard. And then we're also producing an agenda consultation, which focuses on asking the market for input on what the ISSB should be focused on for the next few years, and you can find that on the website when it's published. And we're hoping that that also gets published in Q2 of 2023. We also understand that the reporting landscape is still very busy. And so we have ongoing dialogue with EFRAG, the European Commission, working on how to incorporate jurisdictional requirements into the standards or how they can be added on. There's also, our board's very busy redeliberating some of the decisions and language that was included in the exposure draft. Again, we've adopted the TCFD architecture to drive interoperability, and then we're working with GRI. We have a memorandum of understanding with them to develop an interoperability and guidance for companies to be able to disclose to both. And then CDP just announced that they are going to align their platform for IFRS, for the climate-related disclosure, or IFRS S2, to reduce market fragmentation. So that's a lot. You might be wondering, well, how do I prepare for all of these new disclosures? And so the reason that we think that this is really important for companies to start preparing for is because they're really meant to be cost effective for companies to report to, developed with efficiency in mind, decision useful for investors. So designed to provide the right amount and level of information that's useful for investors, and then market informed. So everything we put out has gone out for public comment. We do outreach to both entities and investors and regulators to understand how we can improve the standards. And so if you're a company, you might be asking, well, how can I actually prepare for this if I decide that we should do this? And really the first step is to evaluate your internal systems and processes for collecting and reporting on sustainability related information. Consider the sustainability related risks and opportunities that might affect your business. And then there's a ton of supporting materials that you can review on the website, including the SASB standards, the CDSB framework, and the TCFD recommendations. Also, the good news is if you're already reporting to one or more of these, you'll be very well positioned to report to the new standards that are coming out at the end of this year. And you might be familiar with the SASB standards or the Sustainability Accounting Standards Boards for S1, so the general related disclosure requirement, that requires companies to consider the SASB standards to look at it in the absence of an IFRS sustainability standard. And so you may or may not know, but SASB has 77 industry-based disclosure standards, also meant to provide investors with comparable information on the sustainability factors that are most relevant to financial performance. They were developed in a very similar, rigorous way. And we have over 2,000 entities reporting to the SASB standards. And I believe this number is even more higher than 56% of outside the US. And the ISSB has committed to advancing industry-specific disclosure requirements as part of the merger. And then also in S2, or the climate-related disclosure standards, there will be industry-based guidance that basically takes the SASB standard climate metrics and adds them in so an entity can report to those metrics as well. So this is just a screenshot to understand what's happening in each of the standards. So as I mentioned, for S1, the general requirements, it's a requirement to consider the SASB standards currently and the disclosure topics associated with them and the metrics. And then for IFRS 2, those industry-based climate-related topics and metrics will be produced as industry-based guidance that a company can use to meet that requirement. Also, under SASB, we had a project for alternative proteins and products, which is also why we were a part of this call. And what we found from that project is we had evidence of environmental and social impact, working very closely with FAIRR. And all the data that Sophia produced was evidence that we brought to our board to say that we should update the standards. We had evidence that these products could financially impact companies. And we had a huge amount of investor interest in understanding performance of entities around the alternative protein space. So what resulted was a recommended change to 3 different industries. So our meat, poultry, and dairy industry, the processed food industry, and then the food distributors and retailers industry, with 3 additional metrics being proposed. We have a basis for conclusion, so you can go ahead and look at what those exact metrics are and why we proposed those metrics. And the ISSB has committed to advancing this project, and before it can go into the standards, the SASB standards, to be updated, it has to go through a public comment period. So we're hoping that that happens this year. Unfortunately, I don't know exactly when that might be coming out. And then the last thing companies can really do to prepare, besides reading the exposure drafts and the SASB standards, is to implement TCFD recommendations. So reporting and understanding governance strategy, risk management metrics and targets around climate-related risks and opportunities. This is also widely supported standard that we've adopted under the ISSB. So there's a lot of information in your toolkit and on our website. I'm not going to talk about all of these, but they'll be in the slides for the recording later. And you can also, all of our board meetings and all these materials are public on the ifrs.org website. So that's a wealth of information that you can go check out in preparation. There's also ways that you can download the standard staff or any input you might have. We're always open to feedback and having consultations on these. We also have podcasts and summaries. So yeah, hopefully there's a wealth of information that you can get involved with. And then I have our contact information if you have any questions about the ISSB or alternative proteins project. But I'll stop there and see if there are any questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Devin. Marika, I believe there were definitely a few questions on this presentation.
Yes, thank you also for helping me make sense of alphabet soup. I wonder if there's like an index or somewhere with just a list of these acronyms and definitions. Sure, a quick Google search would help that. But a couple of questions. The first one is, how do companies actually report to ISSB standards? Do they submit disclosures to IFRS? Do they publish them in sustainability reports? Do they send them to their investors, or a combination, or something altogether different?
That's a great question. So the effective date of when we're asking entities to disclose these is 2024. So you have a little bit of time to prepare. So no one has actually reported to these standards yet because they're not finalized. But at SASB, what we saw was that a lot of entities would report in to those metrics in their sustainability report. Some also reported in their 10Ks and then posted it on their website. And yeah, definitely send it to the investors. They're meant to be investor focused. So hopefully that will help answer their questions. We've seen an index. And if you go on the SASB.org website, which still exists, you can look at reporters to SASB and look at how other companies are doing it. But we don't actually, it's not a certification. So we're not endorsing that these are aligned or not. That's really up to if you get assurance or your investors, things like that, to be able to report. Also jurisdictional requirements as well.
That makes sense. Thank you. The next question, this person was asking if ISSB reportings are expected to flow into the ESG ratings by companies like Sustainalytics and MSCI.
That's a great question. So I believe that the SASB standards did to some extent, but I can't speak to how they'll incorporate these standards into their ratings and at this time.
Understandable. And one last one. Is there a plan to consider impact-oriented disclosures alongside risk-oriented disclosures?
I'm not fully sure I understand the question, but what I can say is that they're designed to measure both the risk and opportunities that companies face in terms of sustainability so sustainability related risk and opportunities, as well as climate specific risk and opportunities. The standards are also meant to be neutral. So we're not saying that, one company or one entity's performance is better than another, but that's really up to the investors to decide. And that's the whole purpose of having comparable disclosures, is that an entity can benchmark themselves against their peers. An investor can look and say, okay, who's performing on how I want to invest versus not. So they're meant to be neutral in that way. And I hope that answered the question. If not, whoever asked that, please feel free to email me and I can try to provide a better answer for you.
Wonderful. Open invitation there. Thank you so much, Devin. I think I'll pass it back to Carlotta. Thanks all for the questions too.
Wonderful. Thanks both. Then it's time for our final speaker of the day. I'm so thrilled to introduce Sharon Murray. Sharon is GFI's U.S. Investor Engagement Manager, and she supports investors in exploring, understanding, and investing in the alternative protein industry. And she's very excitingly going to be sharing the new alternative protein ESG framework that GFI and FAIRR have co-developed. So Sharon, the floor is yours.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Carlotta, and great to see so many of you on the call today. I know this is a topic that comes up quite a bit in GFI's engagement across stakeholders. So hopefully you're learning a lot. I certainly am. So as Carlotta noted, this last part of today's LINC seminar is going to focus on ESG reporting specifically for alternative protein products. It's going to build on Devin's excellent presentation of global ESG standards by introducing a reporting tool that GFI and FAIRR collaborated on very closely. So really we're bringing this entire session full circle. So as we've been discussing, and you all know by now, there's been this growing recognition of the role alternative proteins can play in mitigating climate biodiversity crises. And at the same time, investors are increasingly integrating ESG considerations into their investment decision-making, which has been also increasing demand for standardized industry-specific ESG disclosures and assessments. And while such standards exist for many other industries, I think Devin said they have 77 in the SASB Standards, an alternative protein-specific ESG reporting framework has not been published until GFI and FAIRR did so last September. Now, of course, the alternative products disclosure topic that Devin spoke to can support such reporting, which is really exciting, but it won't be final still for some time, and it is somewhat limited to a few disclosures, and so may not meet the full needs of all protein companies and their investors. This lack of existing industry standards had led to many companies and investors in the industry trying to determine ESG monitoring and reporting approaches independently, which of course is not only inefficient, but it really doesn't allow for comparability, which is really critical for investors and isn't necessarily aligned with ESG reporting best practices. Not everyone can be an expert in this complex space. Both FAIRR and GFI were seeing these trends through our stakeholder engagements, and so we decided to combine our expertise to produce these first of their kind ESG reporting frameworks for the alternative protein industry. So one of these frameworks is for companies that specialize in alternative proteins, while the other one is for companies that incorporate alternative proteins into a broader business. This development process took over a year and incorporated input from over 50 investors, companies, and ESG experts. Devin was actually also quite helpful here, so thank you. And this resulted in us publishing Excel-based reporting tools in which companies can directly enter their disclosures to share this with investors and other stakeholders, as well as accompanying technical guides that provides detail on the framework's development process and additional context and guidance on these topics and themes. While these two frameworks do overlap, they do have a different set of companies, as I just mentioned, to which they'll apply, and slightly different scopes of the products they cover. So let's go through that. First off, the diversified framework was developed for protein producers, food manufacturers, and food retailers that produce and retail a range of products that include alternative proteins. And just to give you a sense of a few companies to which this would apply and who actually contributed their insights to this framework, these included Unilever, Danone, ConAgra, and Mafrig. And I know that some in this audience are diversified ingredient and input companies. So I also wanted to address how these frameworks might apply to you in case you're wondering. So first of all, while the diversified framework was not designed specifically for ingredient companies, a subset of the disclosures would still apply well to such companies and might be helpful in their own reporting. And then secondly, as your alternative protein customers may very well be filling out these frameworks, that's certainly our goal. And to report to many of these disclosures, they're going to have to work closely with their suppliers. And so in this case, both the diversified and specialized framework can help suppliers prepare for this process of supporting their customers and create a competitive advantage. Those of you in the audience that are specialized ingredient and input suppliers, so specializing in alternative proteins, many of you do fall within the scope of the specialized framework, so you'll see that in a moment. Moving on to how we define alternative proteins. For the diversified framework, this encompasses analogs that directly substitute animal-derived products or ingredients. This can use plant-based, fermentation-enabled, and cultivated food technologies, or any combination thereof. It also includes foods that partially substitute animal-derived products. It includes plant-based protein made by conventional fermentation. So this is your tofu, your seitan, or your tempeh. And then plant-based whole food proteins and fats. So legumes, nuts, grains, pulses are also all included in this scope. This framework is meant to be supplementary, really just focus on the alt protein parts of these diversified companies' businesses. And this is because we know that most of these companies are already likely reporting full company ESG disclosures through something like the ISSB or SASB historically. And therefore, we didn't want to add burden there. We wanted to provide something that was additive. Meanwhile, the specialized framework was created for use by manufacturers and select ingredient and input suppliers whose core focus is alternative proteins. So again, a few examples of companies who contributed to this framework and to whom this would apply are Miyoko's, Olive Farms, Myco Technology, and Eat Just. For this framework, the scope of the term alternative proteins is nearly identical, but there's an exception that plant-based whole foods are excluded in this case. And unlike the diversified framework, this framework is actually meant to serve as a holistic one-stop shop, if you will, for ESG reporting by specialized companies. We do recognize, though, that maybe some investors are used to using other voluntary frameworks. They may be regulatory frameworks over time that apply. And so we did align the framework with major ESG standards where possible. So the specialized framework overlaps anywhere from something like 55 to 75% with major voluntary frameworks like SASB, GRI, CDP, and B Corp. There were a few principles that were really critical for us when we set about developing these frameworks that I wanted to walk you all through. So the first is that the framework inquires about risks over the medium and long term, rather than focusing solely on the short term. Secondly, these frameworks, especially the specialized one, are customizable to allow companies to tailor disclosures to their capabilities and capacities. So for example, for the specialized framework, this is done by differentiating by manufacturing capacity and production. So lab stage companies are not expected to report. Pilot and demo stage are expected to report a much more limited set of disclosures. And then commercial or industrial scale are expected to report more. And then we have an advanced set of metrics. And then the diversified also is split between core and advanced. And we really wanted to include this framework flexibility because we know that a lack of such flexibility can often be a barrier to ESG reporting, especially for private companies with less capacity to do so. So we wanted to minimize that barrier. And then third, in recognition of the fact that there are often challenges with ESG scoring. So there was that question on Sustainalytics and MSCI. Sometimes these scores just don't accurately reflect the true ESG risks and impacts of a company. At least I know those scores are often lowly correlated with one another, so they're far from perfect. And so neither framework at this time includes a quantitative benchmark or scoring system. Rather, we're just encouraging companies to provide precise, transparent disclosures that can also counter claims of greenwashing, and then allow investors and other stakeholders to draw their own conclusions. Then finally, rather than simply asking about companies' targets or aspirations, these can certainly be an important tool, but we also wanted to link disclosures to realized impact companies are having on their environment and society. And actually, in our engagement with companies thus far, especially those that are more advanced in their reporting, we've seen a lot of excitement over integrating some of these more impact-oriented metrics and disclosures into their reporting. So to head off a few questions that we've received often, these are 3 of them. And as a preview, the answer to all 3 is no, but I'll go through them in more detail. So the first question asks if there is a minimum alternative proteins revenue requirement for diversified companies who want to report. And the answer is that there's not. So no matter the amount of revenue related to alternative proteins, all diversified companies who produce products that incorporate alternative proteins can report to this framework. The second question asks if disclosures are required by a regulatory entity. And the answer here again is no. So the disclosures do align to various degrees with some of the SEC's drafted climate-related disclosures in the US, for example, as well as some of the drafted ISSB standards, certainly the SASB standards, which, as Devin had spoken to, might relate to jurisdictional requirements in the future, and they're working on that. But for this specific framework and version, there's no regulatory body mandating it. And then the third question is asking whether GFI and FAIRR are going to publish disclosures by companies. And the answer is no. At this time, neither organization plans to publish any full framework responses. And in fact, we're not asking companies to provide disclosures to us. Rather, this is a tool used to share disclosures with investors. FAIRR may in the future reserve the right to use some of these frameworks as part of their excellent indices. So that could be coming down the pipeline, but that's still not quite the same in terms of publishing the full disclosures. We also do encourage companies to publish select disclosures or as much of the framework as they feel comfortable and are allowed to legally on their own websites or integrate them into their annual sustainability reporting. And we do list a subset of metrics to consider for this purpose in the FAQ section of our website. So there are other questions we get. We have a FAQ section, as I noted, on our website, so you can see full responses to these questions and others. What's next? First of all, if you're not among the 1,200 or so individuals who have downloaded our framework, you can do so on the website listed on this slide or on FAIRR's website. Like all GFI resources, these are open access and free to use by anyone. The website also offers an opportunity to share feedback. So that's either for improvements in the future, anything and everything you want to see here about these frameworks, including case studies on how you're using them. If you send us these, we will follow up. We're really curious to learn more. And then we also welcome you reaching out if you want to meet with GFI team members to discuss how this might be applied to your business. And so feel free to email me. My email is here on this slide, and I'll either meet with you directly or direct your email to the appropriate team member. And now I am happy to take some questions, and I can leave this slide up for a moment or two so folks can grab the links if they need.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sharon. I like that you got started on the Q&A already a little bit in your presentation. Let's see if we can pull Marika up as well to see if any other questions came in.
Awesome. Thanks, Sharon. One of them you just answered a bit, but feel free to add more. Someone asked how GFI is using these frameworks in our engagement with companies. You mentioned that folks could reach out to schedule calls with us. If you want to share a little bit more about kind of any outreach that we're doing, that would be helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, certainly anybody's welcome to reach out, and we have gotten some inbound inquiries from companies that are interested in using this framework as well as by investors. We're also conducting proactive outreach to encourage adoption and to ensure that companies across the industry and investors know these frameworks exist. As I mentioned earlier, comparability is really important. With any tool like this, the more companies and investors that are using it, the more useful it is for everyone. And so we are conducting proactive outreach, and so is FAIRR, across the various stakeholders that could use this framework. That's including one-on-one meetings, presentations like this one, presentations at conferences, and more. This is also a tool that colleagues of mine, including Marika, can use in their engagements with diversified companies in particular to help them understand the impact alternative proteins can have in meeting some of their corporate social responsibility goals. So this is really very similar with the type of conversations that Sophia and the team at FAIRR are having with these companies, although unfortunately we don't have those trillions of investors behind us quite in the same way.
Thanks, Sharon. Yeah, putting in a plug. I lead our engagement with retailers and food service companies. So if you'd like to chat with me about our ESG frameworks, please reach out. You should have my email from all the various link emails. Second question, Sharon, you defined alternative proteins within each framework. What if a company defines alternative proteins differently to how the framework does? Can they still use the frameworks? And if so, how should they report?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'd be curious to know what that is, because I think we're quite inclusive, but I know some include insect proteins, for example, as alternative proteins, so perhaps that's where that's coming from. So we defined it based on how GFI in particular, as well as FAIRR, consider alternative proteins. And for diversified companies, plant-based whole foods are part of that typically, so it was included there, specialized not. So just a little bit of the logic behind how this is done. That being said, the way that the Excel-based kind of reporting is set up is that one section is this business tab where you define the parts of your business that you're reporting on. So even if it doesn't perfectly match the definitions we have, you can define other sections or a subset of these segments within that Excel, and then investors and other stakeholders will understand that that's what your disclosures report to. Now, if you incorporate categories outside of what we define, some of the disclosure topics might not apply as well, right? They might just not apply as well to how you are producing those proteins, but many of them are much more general, don't apply to one specific type of alternative protein, and so much of the framework should still be usable.
Thank you, Sharon. I will pass it back over to Carlotta now for the sake of time. Please reach out to Sharon or any of us at GFI with more questions about our frameworks.
All right, thank you both so much. And thank you to all of our speakers for sharing their expertise with us. Thank you all to participants for joining. And before we head into the virtual networking, I briefly want to discuss some in-person networking. So as I'm sure many of you are aware, conference season is kicking off. And we'd love to, as GFI, get a sense of what events you're planning to attend this year. So we actually have a quick poll. It's the first time we're including a poll. So oh yeah, it's working, at least I see it. So yeah, a poll to understand which conferences are you planning to attend. If you could let us know, that would be great. And that gives us a sense of, where the industry will be and hopefully find opportunities to connect. In the next month, we as GFI will have colleagues at Future Food Tech San Francisco and Expo West. So if you want to connect with us there, please feel free to reach out. You can email us at corporate@gfi.org, email, or just respond to any of the linked emails you'll receive, and it will go to that general inbox as well. So that's super helpful for us to know. We're also considering hosting some in-person events in the future, and we'd love to just get a poll of, would you be interested in attending an in-person link mixer? So we can get a better understanding if that would be valuable for you for us to build out this community in that way. All right, well, thank you for providing your quick feedback there. So now it's time for today's networking. For those of you who haven't joined this portion of the session before, our feedback surveys really shown that people consider this really valuable. It's a great opportunity to connect with other companies, to build relationships, exchange ideas, maybe even find opportunities to partner. So hop into the Meet Away link, which I think Marika chatted before, but she'll put in the chat again. Now, all you need to do is follow the prompts. Once you enter the site, you'll be paired with a new person every 5 minutes. You can also select who you'd like to meet on the homepage, and there's some great functionality that'll let you extend the meeting time if you're having a great conversation, take notes, share your contact info there. So I think that's it for me for now. Thank you so much. Happy networking, and see you at the next seminar.